Welcome to the Valseth View.
Hello and welcome back to the Valseth View with Carolyn and Valerie Clark of Valseth Enterprises. Together, they bring a unified perspective to today's most complex business challenges, combining legal strategy and compliance expertise to help organizations grow with confidence. I'm Chelsea, and in today's episode, we're looking at mergers, acquisitions, and strategic partnerships, and why the right alignment between legal and compliance can determine whether the deal succeeds or stalls. Welcome back. Carolyn, when clients first start exploring a merger or acquisition, what's the earliest legal groundwork that needs to be in place before negotiations move forward?
Okay, so there's a lot of moving parts when you get into mergers and acquisitions, and it's not as simple as a lot of people think. So usually what I do is I sit down with my clients and we have a short discussion about how a merger or an acquisition is kind of like a marriage. And I explain to them that it's very important that you engage your legal early and that you go through kind of a set framework of how you're going to process the entire merger or acquisition. And I always start with the beginning step, which is developing your acquisition strategy. So we have to talk about if you are going to merge or you are going to purchase a company, what is your intention? Do you want the employees that are currently working within the company to stay there? Or are you intending to take over that company and then put new people in there? So you have to really think through that initial first step as well. I think that sometimes people see a company, they think, oh, this is a great fit for me, and they're ready to jump in, they're ready to purchase, or they're ready to merge with them. And they haven't thought through some of the basic goals and protections that you have to have in place for yourself. So even in the initial contact and even in your planning process, you really have to think through your strategy so that when you're discussing it with your future partners or with the future business owners, that everyone is on the exact same page about what exactly is going to happen with both companies, not just the purchasing company, but also the one that's being acquired. Because I think it's very easy to forget that there's two people or two companies involved in this. So you need to think through the process. As an attorney, legally, one of the first steps that I tell people is once you've done that initial screening part, you also need to make sure that you sign an NDA, which is a non-disclosure agreement, because if you do get into discussions about things that are proprietary to your business, you want to make sure that you don't have someone that can walk away with all of that business knowledge and then take that for themselves. So signing an NDA is very important within this process because you need to feel comfortable as a group that you guys can have some real candid conversations about what is going on. And then the next step right after that, or immediately after it, where you need to have legal engage, is in the due diligence process, which is the company, do they have an accurate valuation? Is everything that they've claimed that they own, do they actually really have possession of that? There's a lot of moving parts within it. So I think that it's critical that when you're going through mergers and acquisitions that you engage with your legal team right away. And I don't know if on the compliance side, I've left something out for you, Valerie.
I would just add that compliance should be there from the very beginning as well, because if you're not buying into the same industry, then you're going to have a quick education about what are the regulatory concerns from the other business. Are there any that align with what you are currently responsible for in your current business? Or like an example of that would be some employment laws. Or are they completely new regulations that you're going to have to learn and know at the beginning, at least a generalization of them? Because again, you're going to go back and you're going to have to take the information that you learn and that your executive management learns at the appropriate time and make sure that your employees learn it, because we're about regulation and everyone has to know what is required. And the important thing about compliance is there are things that may only come up once a year, but there are things that you have to do daily in order to be in compliance and to stay in compliance. And knowing those differences are very important, especially when you are not working with one company, but you're possibly working with a merger or an acquisition.
Many organizations treat compliance as something just to check off after the contract sign. So, why is it so important to integrate compliance into the due diligence from day one?
From my perspective, if it's not documented, it's not compliant. When federal auditors come in or when attorneys come in, and they look at the documents of a company and they're asking for, show me your financial assessment for this particular project and show me whatever was spent on line item Z. You have to have that. If you don't have it, doesn't matter if you can talk about it. Doesn't matter if you can bring people in who benefited from that. You have to have the documentation that someone can see if it is required from a compliance standpoint. And so that is something that is huge, is you have to know not just the regulation, but how is it going to be reviewed? How is it going to be audited? And then, like I have said several times, it's not enough just for the executive management to know that part of the puzzle of what is required for the documentation, or just the compliance office. Everyone has to know, especially using the example of the financial review, especially those in finance, especially those in contracts, especially those who have to work with the CPA. Compliance doesn't work in a bubble. If it does, it's going to pop, and it's going to unfortunately reveal some invisible liability.
Carolyn, can you share an example where a deal looked solid legally, but then there was a compliance issue later that caused a problem or delay?
Sure. I'll share two because it kind of gives you multiple examples of what can happen. The first one was a merger between a company that dealt specifically with healthcare products and a business that just sold general products. One of the things that the business that just sold general products was not really aware of or hadn't thought of as they were going through the merger and acquisition process was all of the additional regulations that tend to surround a healthcare industry. And so what they didn't have, or what wasn't in place for them, was a lot of the internal checks and balances that HIPAA requires and other things need. So the company that was just selling traditional business products took them a while to get up to speed so that they could then be working within that realm. It's kind of a something that you don't think about when you're selling or when you're purchasing a company, but it was something that did cause a minor hiccup because they had to retrain employees, make sure that they met all of those standards prior to the acquisition taking place. The second one was one that dealt specifically with government contracts, and it was a company where they had purchased a lot of equipment over the course of time while they had the government contract. And a lot of that equipment that they had listed in their due diligence report, they had listed as owned by the company. Well, technically it wasn't owned by the company. It's still owned by the federal government because it was purchased with federal funds. So that did kind of cause a difference in the valuation of the company. So those are just two small examples of the kinds of things that you can run into when we're talking about mergers and acquisitions.
So, Valerie, a culture and policy alignment can be a major challenge after a merger. How do you assess whether two organizations' compliance cultures are compatible before they combine their operations?
That's where both companies have to do their homework. They have to make sure that they are fully aware of what their compliant obligations are, that they understand how to meet those obligations, and then that they have the correct processes in place for whenever this potential new company comes in or they merge, whenever they want to start looking at that documentation, that the documentation is actually there. Mm-hmm. And that is a very important part of compliance is many times what happens, policy manuals will sit on a shelf. And that is not what policy manuals are for. When I was in healthcare, my very first position was at a teaching hospital, and I was part of administration that We did 12 on, 12 off, and we worked with the hospital staff and with the patients. And I cannot tell you how many hours I would spend in the medical library looking at the policy and procedure manual, making sure that I got it right in my response. And what I learned from that was policies are really your friend. I know that's a silly statement, but that's very truthful. If you do something, make sure you can stand on a policy. So it's very important for whoever makes policy, whoever writes policy, that there is a central clearinghouse where they go to and where they are kept. Because if you change something in policy format, but again, don't do the training and the teaching with the staff, then you have not accomplished anything. And in fact, you've created some liability, because if the federal government comes in and says, I want to look at such and such, and part of what you hand them is the training records, or you have them speak with 5 to 10 different employees that know what to do. But then when it comes down to it, what they know what to do is not in policy format. That's where you're going to have an issue.
For leadership teams that are looking to move fast and they heard you say a few hours and they're like, oh no, I want to go fast. What's a risk of skipping or rushing through the compliance review process?
You're just going to miss a lot of things that you're going to pay for later. An example would be if you're having to decide if you're going to merge a financial program with another financial program, or if you're going to create a new one, or if you're just going to wait and hope that those two separate programs are compatible. When it gets down to actually doing that, and you haven't done the legwork to say, hey, I know it is compatible or it's not, and you find out that it's not compatible, then you basically have halted the business of your company. You can't go forward with anything. And that's the risk of not taking the time of making sure that you're compliant in those necessary areas. Carolyn, do you have something else to add to that?
No, I think that you've perfectly phrased it, Valerie. I think that a lot of, especially when it's two companies coming together in a merger or acquisition, a lot of it is communication between the two compliance departments, hopefully, if they have them. And if they don't, it's going to be a lot of education on the part of one company educating the other about where they need to get to or where they need to be in order to be compliant.
Carolyn, once a deal closes, what should counsel focus on to ensure the new entity is staying protected through this transition period?
Okay, if you want to talk like post-merger integration, one of the things that you really need to look at is you need to be sure that you're going through all of the steps to kind of file that particular merger or acquisition in all of the areas where it needs to be done. For example, you're going to need to notify the secretaries of state if they're two different companies from two different states. You're going to have to do that. You need to make sure that you're notifying if there's any federal partner that either company is working with, that you've notified them and that you've made sure that they understand that a merger or an acquisition has taken place. And the last thing that you really need to stay on top of, and I think that it is kind of a very slippery slope for a lot of companies, is if there are contracts that either or both companies have with third parties, you really need to engage your legal so that they can make sure that those third parties understand, first of all, what happened in that particular merger or acquisition, who's in charge of their contract now, who are their new points of contact, do we want to renegotiate the deal? So all of those things that are post-closing kind of action items, you really need to make sure that you tie in closely with your legal so that you're doing all of those steps and completing them in a timely fashion.
And Valerie, how can compliance officers and operations leaders help reinforce that legal structure once the merger or partnership is underway?
That's a very good question. One of the things that should be started whenever the conversations turn really serious and a merger or acquisition is going to take place and it becomes public knowledge for your staff, you really need to build staff buy-in. That means you keep them abreast of what's going on. You don't have to tell them every single item, but you need to keep them with enough information so that they feel like they are part of moving forward with the company as opposed to being left behind and possibly being terminated, because those people who feel secure in their job setting, they are going to produce more. They're going to be more receptive to new employees possibly coming in. They're going to be receptive to the changes that take place in management, that take place in policy, that may even take place in work hours and work locations. And so making sure that you have the buy-in from the employees and then being honest with them. Don't act secretive with what you share. You want to be transparent as you can, and you need to be trustworthy whenever you share this information with employees, because you just need to remember what it feels like to have someone else in charge of your paycheck and not knowing if your family's going to be fed for 2 weeks or 2 months. You have to build that culture. And this is an open culture. We value everyone regardless of what we're doing. And as we add new people or as we merge with this company, everyone will become and remain important, not just those that are coming in.
And finally, for organizations planning growth or collaboration in the next year, what's one piece of advice you'd give for building legal and compliance coordination into every deal from the start?
Well, I think that we've already kind of touched on the idea of how you can create a good corporate culture. That's very important. I also think that when you're moving in or when you're in the time of a merger acquisition, there are a lot of things that they need to think about, like, for example, data privacy between the two companies. How are you going to work all of that? Things like making sure that if we're transferring property, including intellectual property, how are we going to handle that as well between the two parties? Some other like regulatory filings and notifications, establishing who's going to be the person or the company that's going to take lead in that particular instance to do it. Do we want to engage with the staff from the previous company to have them do that since they've already done those filings in the past, or will we need them to do them in the future? And then also something that is kind of a hot topic right now, which is the idea of cybersecurity between the two entities. If we're merging platforms that both of them are working on, how are we going to make that be a seamless transition for our employees? But I agree with the point that Valerie made, which was the idea that once you build that team environment between the two companies, it's very important to foster that all the way through the compliance that's going to happen between the two of them.
Excellent. Well, that wraps up today's episode of the Valseth View with Carolyn Dragseth and Valerie Clark of Valseth Enterprises. To learn more about their integrated approach to strategy, risk, and organizational excellence, visit Valseth Enterprises. And on the site, you're going to find helpful tip sheets that you can download about today's topic. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. See you soon.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.